fine. Okay. I didn't get it. It's fine. Okay. Fortunately, those people know. Well, because they weren't. Okay. It's fine, but I don't want it.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. First, we have a couple of announcements. The first announcement is I'd like to introduce myself, if I could, to you. My name is David Pryor. I'm the new director of the Institute of Politics here, and we extend to you a very cordial welcome rainy October evening, right almost on election eve, almost here at the Institute of Politics. The second announcement I'd like to make, I've just been informed that there's an open monitor in case any of you would like a more comfortable environment to participate in Mr. Koppel's show this evening here in the forum. But right back there in room 4O. Tonight, the Shorenstein Center, together with the Institute of Politics, is sponsoring this very interesting program with one of America's own family, and that is Ted Koppel, of course. For 20 years, since ABC Nightline, Ted Koppel has been a part of, an integral part of coming into our homes each evening as a part of ABC's Nightline show. So we are very, very flattered. We're honored tonight to have him as a guest in our forum here in the Institute of Politics, the Kennedy Center, and we're proud to co-host with the Shorenstein Center. Let me tell you just a moment about what is coming up for next week, early in the week, just an announcement or two. First, on Monday night, the night before the election. Now, Ted, this is going to be an interesting night because at 6 o'clock in the evening, right here on this stage, will be Spike Lee. And Spike Lee will be talking to us and visiting with us and answering our questions about race and the media. Very timely. So Spike Lee will be here. 2 hours after that, at 8 o'clock, we will have a very, very distinguished speaker and a lot of Q&A from Jeff Rosen. Jeff Rosen is a constitutional law professor at George Washington University, a graduate of Harvard. He will be talking to us about the election and the United States Supreme Court as to what we might expect should Mr. Gore be elected or should Mr. Bush be elected. So that, again, will be a double-header evening of interesting undertakings that we will all, I hope, want to participate in. Alex Jones is the new director of the Shorenstein Center. The Shorenstein Center, of course, is associated with the Kennedy School. It is the Center for Press, Politics, and Public Policy. Alex Jones, of course, has been for a number of years with the New York Times, for almost 10 years, as a matter of fact. He was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 1987. He and his wife wrote together a book entitled The Trust, which is the history, the definitive history of the New York Times. It is truly my honor and our honor tonight to introduce our friend Alex Jones, who will present Mr. Koppel. Alex.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I want to tell you that our point of departure tonight is this book that Ted Koppel has written. This book, Off Camera, Private Thoughts Made Public, is a very unusual one in many respects for a journalist. Most journalists who write about themselves wait until they have retired. Ted did not. He has done something that a lot of journalists don't do. He's revealed himself at least to an extent that he does not as a matter of discipline and as a matter of sort of style on Nightline. Tonight I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes with Ted about some of the things in this book that are about him. It involves politics, but it also involves the human being. Let me tell you very briefly, Ted has, as David said, won every award in broadcast journalism. He has been the anchor of Nightline for 20 years. He was also co-author with my colleague and predecessor as director of the Shorenstein Center, Marvin Kalb, in another book called In the National Interest. Based on his new book, I can tell you some other things about it. He's worried about what he calls sinking into old fartism.
It's too late. It's too late already.
He gets depressed. Not disabled depressed, but depressed. Depressed enough and chronically enough to take note of it. And he attributes his depression with giving him a sense of empathy that he thinks is very important. The book has a voice that's kind of a mixed one. It alternates. Sometimes it can be quite cynical. Sometimes it can be almost childlike. He talks about trying to steal his grandson's Barney tape because he felt yearnings to bond with Barney. He talks about a flight from vanitization. This is from his book. What she never does is express an opinion. This, I believe, is at the root of her popularity. We are able to project on her whatever we please, and therefore find her sympathetic. It strikes me that this book that you've written, this journal that you have written, is in a way something of a flight, your own flight, from that syndrome to a degree of being an anchor, being someone who is by journalistic discipline supposed to keep his opinions to himself even while being the aggressive inquirer. Perhaps your most cynical crack in the book is about your dread of being on a TV show in Cleveland and having the rather vacuous interviewer say, "So why did you write this book, Ted?" But let me start by saying,
Actually,
why did you write this book, Ted?
If I could interrupt, that bad dream has already been realized. I was interviewed by one young radio, I assume she was young, radio host. I never actually saw her because it was one of these early morning shows. And her first question was, "So, Mr. Koppel, you've written a journal of the year 1999. And I said, "Yes." She said, "How long did it take you to write it?" Well, it began on January 1st and ended on December 31st. You know, it's sort of in the nature of a journal. But I'm sorry I interrupted you.
Well, in that tradition, let me ask again, why did you decide to sort of, I know that this book is not what I would call a soul-bearing book, but it is an intimate book in its way, and it talks about your background, it talks about some moments in your life that I doubt that you share with a lot of people. Why did you do it?
I must say, I've come up with better reasons for having done it after the fact. I can't say that I really gave a great deal of thought to this before I sat down and began writing the book. But after I realized what it was becoming, it occurred to me that one of the most common things that happens to people in my end of the business, which is to say the television end, is that the audience out there comes to believe, particularly when you're on at 11:30 at night, and they are probably in a state of near repose, or doing all kinds, or just interrupting themselves from doing all kinds of interesting things, that the audience out there has the illusion that they know me already. And I was much struck and referred to it in the introduction to the book by Katie Couric's very brave decision to allow herself to be examined for rectal cancer and to have that videotape shown on national television. But it also occurred to me that anyone who has seen that side of Katie cannot help but believe, since this is probably a more intimate view of her than you have seen of your closest other, that people must feel that they really know Katie well. And she has this charming personality anyway, and so it's easy to get that feeling. But even those of us who are significantly less charming than Katie, when you have appeared, and I've been at ABC now for 37 years, when you've appeared on television, as often and as long as I have, people come to believe that they know what your opinions are anyway. So late in the game, I came to the conclusion that I would rather have people dislike me for what I really believe than like me for what they think I believe.
Has it, prompted people who consider you to be a journalistic power, which you genuinely are, that you have sort of revealed yourself to be what, I don't think that you fit easily in a category, but if I were to categorize it, I would say you're a Bradley Democrat.
I wouldn't. Look, I think there is actually some confusion in the public mind over what a journalist's responsibilities are in that regard. We are not a bunch of intellectual eunuchs who walk around for all of our lives with no opinions on anything. I find journalists to be among the most opinionated men and women I know, and among journalists, I'm probably as opinionated as any of them. My responsibility is not to let my opinion show in my work. It doesn't mean that I can't have opinions at other times. It doesn't mean that I can't even reveal them at other times. It just means that if I'm doing my job properly, then people are going to be watching Nightline and saying, at the end of it, they will jump to some, conclusions anyway. All I can tell you is that my mail, my email, my faxes tend to run pretty evenly, you liberal son of a bitch or you conservative son of a bitch. It doesn't really, they are in total agreement over the last part. It is only the political orientation that still causes them some confusion.
One of the stories you told that I was particularly touched by was the story, first of all, I didn't know, and I doubt that many people did, that you were born in England, that your parents were German, Jewish immigrants, and that you began you had several years at a British boarding school. And while you were at that boarding school, you told a story about how you went into a classroom one day and there was a thing on the blackboard that had all kinds of terrible things about one of your classmates, and then someone went up and erased his name, put your own name in. You were one of 2 Jews at the school. And you found that you were in Coventry, a ritual of the school in which you were shunned, basically, for 2 weeks.
It's actually, it's a British ritual. It's not limited to schools. They do it in the military too. It's just a way of expressing disapproval.
Okay, well, this is what you wrote about that experience when you were roughly 12 years old, I think. I was judged to be a show-off, and so I found myself in Coventry, a form of loneliness that is both painful and conducive to introspection. I am convinced that whatever my abilities at listening, at detecting subtle changes in mood and attitude and tone, they were first shaped in that particular cauldron. What did you mean?
I tried to determine what my, forgive me, I don't mean to keep turning my back on you there, but I had been judged by my classmates to be, as Alex says, a show-off. But the particular crime that I had committed was my parents had actually, the reason I was in a British boarding school at that time was that my parents had gone back to Germany in 1950, where my father was fighting mightily in the German court system to get back those things that the Nazis had taken away from him in the late 30s. My parents really, this was only 5 years after the end of the war, they really did not want me going to school in Germany, hence the decision to send me to a boarding school in England, which is where I had grown up anyway. I came back from one of these vacations, and there are some wonderful little toy cars that are called Shukos, beautifully designed, beautifully executed, and I came back and I bragged about those toy cars. And I think made the unpolitical observation that I thought they were better than their British equivalent, which were called dinkies, not inappropriately, I might add. That was the offense, and for that I was kept in Coventry for 2 weeks. Now, when I say that makes you sort of tune in a little more carefully, it is obvious to me that cannot have been my only offense. I must have offended people in other ways. There must have been a little too much boasting or a little too much, I don't know exactly what it was at that time, but whatever it was, I had not been paying attention to the signals that people generally give off, whether they like you or dislike you. People do it with body language. People do it with subtle phrases that are sometimes thrown into a conversation. And my point there was that I'm pretty sure, and the education was completed many years later when I was diplomatic correspondent, where Marvin Kalb and I became good friends, you learn as a diplomatic correspondent to listen very carefully to what people say. Not only to what they say, but to what they leave out, to what they don't say. And so my conclusion is that if that had not happened to me in my early childhood, it might have taken me a little longer, but I think one of the things that makes me a competent interviewer is that I listen carefully to what my guest is saying, or what my guest is striving mightily not to say.
One of the things you talk about in some detail and with some frustration is that you often, despite the power of Nightline, cannot actually get the people who are the critical decision makers, or if you do get them, they're spinning like mad. They have an agenda, and that they are very, very, that's a veil that's very difficult to penetrate. It's something that my sense is from the book you feel that you sometimes make some dent in, but in general, you view, again, my sense from reading the book, this cycle of spin, this culture of spin, is something that even a Ted Koppel, even a Nightline, has a very difficult time finding a way through.
Yeah, I think that's a correct observation on your part. Look, in Washington D.C., and I forget when I last heard these numbers, but it was some years ago. I suspect the discrepancy has only grown larger. About 10 years ago, we had 3,000 accredited journalists in Washington. It's a huge number. We also had over 10,000 public affairs officers, press secretaries, people who represent the interests of congressmen and congresswomen and senators and people who have cabinet posts and people at the White House and people at each of the various departments of the federal government. 10,000 people whose only job it is to make sure that their boss looks good. And 3,000 people who have come to believe that, like Sisyphus, they are endlessly rolling that stone up the hill only to see it rolling down again, because you're constantly trying to get past the press release. Now, if you happen to be a press secretary or a public affairs officer, you may believe, in all honesty, that what your senator has just done, or what your cabinet officer, what your secretary of your department has just done, is really worthy of attention. How do you get through? How do you, the level of skepticism, the level of resistance that has been built up over many, many years now of press secretaries and public affairs officers trying to spin the press, and the press coming to the conclusion that the only way ever to get to the truth is by ignoring whatever has been put out there by the press officers and striving mightily to find something behind it, has created not merely a climate of mutual distrust, but when put into the further cauldron of immediacy, which is something relatively new to journalism. I mean, we've always had deadlines in our business, and we've always tried to meet those deadlines in our business, but the deadlines used to be once a day. Or the deadlines might be once every few hours if a newspaper had more than one edition. Or the deadline for a network like ABC, again, was once a day for the early evening news, and then gradually a few years later we had the morning news. Now you have cable networks whose deadline is constant, and the pressure to produce information all day long creates a dynamic in which getting it on first becomes more important than getting it right. And when that coexists in the atmosphere I described a few minutes ago, where there's already a sense of mistrust and skepticism existing between the people who are shoveling information out and the people who are trying to act as gatekeepers and sift out, A, what is true from what is untrue, and B, what is important from what is less important, it creates a huge problem. We've got more media today than we have ever had. There is greater pressure today to get it on immediately. And the sense of mistrust, I suspect, is worse than it has ever been. Those are not healthy conditions.
Well, if you are trying to penetrate those veils, and if I may, let's talk about the spin aspect of it
Sure.
for a moment, aside from the accuracy. It's more a matter of trying to find out what was actually motivated, what caused things to happen, what really happened, if you will. Do you think that the public values that? Or is that something that is being used to sort of pummel the press, it seems, because of the effect it has of discrediting effectively whatever the government is saying often?
Yeah, I think there's probably less and less confidence in the media at large, which I find particularly unfortunate because the media these days, I mean, I don't have to remind a Harvard audience, but media is a plural. And there is sometimes a sense out there that when you're talking about media, you're talking about a homogeneous group. It is more heterogeneous today than it has ever been before. And I frequently argue that television journalism, for example, today, and print journalism today, is better than it's ever been. Simultaneously, unfortunately, it is also worse than it has ever been. You know, we have more good journalism and more bad journalism coexisting, and frequently the bad drives out the good. And particularly when it operates in that environment that I described a moment ago, of a need to be first. That creates a very, very dangerous kind of situation, and I think the public at large feels about us pretty much the way they tend to feel about Congress in general, and then their own congressmen in particular. I mean, you know, we often find that they have a very low regard for Congress in general, and a very high regard for their own representative. And people see absolutely nothing paradoxical about that, and see nothing paradoxical about, you know, coming up to me in the street and saying, I hate the media, I like you.
Have you thought about running for office then?
You'll be happy to know that the answer is no. Not seriously.
One of the things that you observed, and interesting thought, is that you say there's no big personalities, there are no big people, there are no Churchills and Hitlers and Stalins and FDRs. And you say, you wonder aloud, is it the harsh, intrusive cameras and microphones that have too quickly revealed the feet of clay? We're in a campaign now that seems to be about being telegenic, about being able to appear sincere or likable on camera. Do you think that that is the fact of the case, that television and the ability to communicate through the medium of television one-on-one with individuals is now and forever going to be a critical element of political success in this country?
Oh, I would never say forever, but I think it clearly is right now. And what fascinates me, and I don't know whether it is simply a function of the times in which we live, you go back to the 1930s and 40s and just sort of look around the world stage at that time. Good and bad, but leaders who were at least perceived by their own people to be great leaders. People who filled an auditorium all by themselves. Whether you're talking about Churchill or Roosevelt or Chiang Kai-shek or Mussolini or Mao or Mahatma Gandhi or whom have I left out? You know, I mean, there were probably at least half a dozen more. Was that a function of the times? Was that a function of the fact that the world was in crisis and had been in crisis in many respects since the late 1920s? So that populations in these various countries were looking for people of stature. I mean, really people who could get them out of the trouble. And is part of the problem today that things are actually going pretty darn well, that we're not at war at the moment, that we have the lowest unemployment rate in many years, we have the lowest inflation rate in many years. More Americans are working at jobs that they enjoy than has been the case in many years. We've still got our problems, but generally speaking, we don't live in a time of crisis. And that means that you've got, and I want to choose my words carefully, rather ordinary men and women putting themselves forward as national candidates. I had George W. Bush said something rather charming a few months ago when I was doing one of these day-in-the-life campaigns, and I was with him, and I was talking about the perception of him as being, not one of the great intellects of our time. And one of the things that is so likable about George W. Bush is he doesn't bridle at that kind of thing. I mean, he takes it in very good spirit. And he said, look, I'm not suggesting that I'm the best person for President of the United States. I simply think I'm the best person running. Now, this was back during the primaries. And granted, I mean, some of you may have very strong feelings about Alan Keyes or about Senator McCain or about Orrin Hatch or, any one of the other guys, Gary Bauer, who were running at the time. But, put in those terms, you had to sort of nod your head and say, well, yeah, you're not really running against extraordinary competition. I think Senator McCain, certainly in many respects of his life, fits the definition of an extraordinary man, but would he necessarily have made a better president than George W. Bush or Al Gore? I don't know. The problem is the great people who are out there, half a dozen of whom may be sitting in this hall today, are not volunteering. They're not willing to subject themselves to 2 or 3 or 4 years of first thing in the morning, last thing at night, having to get on the phone and raise money, and half a dozen times during the day. Then having to be willing to subject yourself to the scrutiny of the media. I mean, you've got some awfully good journalists out there who want to find out if there is anything in your background that the American public has a right to know about. And you've got some awfully bad journalists out there who are kind of looking from the bottom up, trying to find if there's anything out there that could make for a sensational story and that might cost you your campaign. Now, in that kind of a context, does it surprise us that, not more good people are willing to run for office? If a crisis occurs, I predict that some of those people will, in fact, emerge and will be willing to run the risk because they will also know that in a crisis, the American public is not going to stand for those kinds of, pardon the expression, rectal examinations.
On that note, I'm going to open it up, if I may use those terms, to questions. There are microphones around. If you would, identify yourself in the microphone when you ask your question. Yes, why don't
And
you?
you're going to, if I may say, you're going to have to wave if you're at one of those microphones upstairs, because with the lights in our eyes, it's awfully hard to see.
Right, quite true. Yes.
Hi, my name is Anthony Ekmection. I'm a freshman at the college. This is kind of building on what
Excuse me, but there's more than one college in Boston. Which college did you have in mind?
I figure since we're at Harvard.
Oh, you mean the college?
Yeah, right here. Okay, this is kind of building on what you were just saying. What are your views on where we draw the line that defines journalistic game and the right to privacy? And what information is it not the journalist's role to convey?
I think it varies, and I make the observation in the book that it frequently varies with respect to whether the party is running for national public office. I mean, let's put it this way. If someone is running for President of the United States, I do not think that we automatically have a right to start investigating his wife's behavior or his children's behavior. But once a candidate injects his wife, or in the case of a woman candidate, injects her husband and children into the campaign for what may seem like the most harmless, the most harmless efforts. In other words, making sure that the wife and kids are always there looking adoringly at the candidate as he delivers his campaign remarks. Or putting the wife out there for shows on some of the morning talk shows or afternoon talk shows, or allowing the son or daughter to become engaged in campaigning for their parent, then all of a sudden, I say the line has been expanded to the point that at least you have a right to start asking questions about the wife and the children. A candidate who does not do that, who comes right out at the beginning and says, look, I'm running for the U.S. Senate or I'm running for Congress. My wife is not. My children are not. I'm fair game. You can ask anything you want about me, and indeed my personal life insofar as it reflects negatively, let's say, on my character, or insofar as it reflects positively, is also fair game, but leave my family out of it. My inclination at a point like that would be to say, fair enough. You're not using him for politicking, I won't use him for journalism. And there is obviously, you can go up and down the list. If someone is not a politician, but is the chairman, let's say, of a major corporation, does that person's personal life enter into the business coverage of what that corporation is doing? Initially, I would say the answer is no. But let's say the man is making greater expenditures than perhaps his salary would seem, and you find out that, he's got a girlfriend on the side, and he's siphoning money off to take care of her in the style to which she has become accustomed. Does that then become more relevant? I would say yes, it becomes more of a gray area then. So I think it depends, on, where I don't feel that we have any right to intrude is when a private citizen becomes involved in some sort of a tragedy. Plane goes down, wife of, children of, are standing at the airport. It is clear that they have just lost a loved one. I don't think we have any right. I mean, if someone wants to step forward as a spokesperson for the family, that's fine. But I don't think we have any right to go after them. They didn't choose to be news items. And I think in those cases, we have to show far more sensitivity than in the case, let's say, of someone who goes into public life and therefore makes himself available for scrutiny.
Hi, my name's Rena Miller. I'm a graduate student at the Kennedy School. Sort of to follow up on that issue of investigating certain aspects of candidates' lives and not others. In the beginning, there were some hints in articles in the beginning of the campaign about George Bush Jr.'s business dealings benefiting from his father's position in public office. In particular, there was a story in Time magazine, a big profile of Bush early in the campaign. I forget the date. But I'm curious, I've seen very little in the media that's investigated that, which I think is a very important issue, which is something people really should know about his private life. Why? Can you explain why? I mean, that seems like a very important and a good story, and instead there's been so much focus on whether Gore's likable or Bush is likable, or the relations with their wives. So maybe you could explain that.
No, I agree with you, and I can tell you that an awful lot of time and money and effort went into doing thorough investigations of both men, and not a whole lot was found. But part of the reason for that is also pure economics. We have 4 permanent correspondents at Nightline: Michelle McQueen, Dave Marish, Chris Bury, and John Donvan. You would have to send someone off to Texas for maybe 3 or 4 weeks to adequately pursue a story like that. We can't afford to send them off that long. We really can't. Sometimes and that is why there are certain kinds of stories that I think are covered more effectively and more efficiently by newspapers. But even there, you will find that the investigative units of a newspaper are the most expensive, require by far the most time, and unless it is a gigantic newspaper like the New York Times or the Boston Globe or the Chicago Tribune or the LA Times, they can't afford to do it. You may say, well, you have to afford to do it. Your skeptical look is telling me that all the way from over there. Yeah, maybe we should. But I'm just telling you there are an awful lot of stories that we should cover that we don't for precisely that reason. It costs too much money. What is happening year after year after year is that budgets are being cut. News division budgets are being cut by the networks so that we close down foreign bureaus, or we bring correspondents back and leave a local producer there, because it costs less money to have a local producer who lives on the economy than it does to ship an American producer over there and have to pay for an apartment and living expenses. You're entitled to a straightforward answer, and that really is it. It has more to do with money than laziness, although I will grant you that other stories, and particularly the kind that you refer to, the likability of one, the likability of the other, much easier to cover. And frequently when you are under the deadline of something new every day, for the evening news programs, frequently that gets in the way of stories that take 3 or 5 days or a week or 2 weeks. Early on in the campaign, as you may recall, during the primary season, everyone was trying to figure out just what it was that naughty boy George W. had done before he was 40. And the assumption was that there had been drug use somewhere there. I'll bet you that 50 news organizations in this country wasted hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars trying to nail that one down, and we were never able to do it. Does it mean it didn't happen? No. But at some point or another, you have to say, all right, so I think people got it when he refused to answer questions about drug use before the age of 27 or whatever it was. You can draw your own inference, and in the final analysis, make your own judgment. But those kinds of stories are very tough to do.
Someone up, yes.
My name is Mike Weissman. I work at the Kennedy School. This is another campaign-related question. Some people are of the opinion that the media, taken in aggregate, even if it's not entirely fair to take it in aggregate, have been unduly biased in favor of Bush in campaign coverage over the past several months. For example, regarding the debates, some people think that Gore performed significantly better than Bush in at least the first and the third, but that coverage was kind of neutral overall, and in some cases focused on non-substantial things like Gore's sighing and other issues at the first debate. I just wonder, and I guess there can be arguments made that the media taken in aggregate have been unduly biased toward Gore on the other side, but I wonder what your view is on how the media are handling this election, and if you think there's bias on either side.
Well, I just spent the better part of an hour a couple of hours ago on one of your local radio talk shows, which has a fairly conservative host and apparently a rather conservative listenership. They were absolutely convinced beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was the personification of Al Gore's front man. They had no doubts whatsoever what side I come down on. I tried, excuse me, I tried to point out to them that they really don't know how I vote, and neither do you. And that we try to do an even-handed job on this. I think your question has a legitimate point to it, and that is the expectations prior to the debates were that Gore was absolutely going to wipe the floor with this rather dumb, not terribly well-informed guy from Texas who had been managing to slip by on easy charm alone. And what happens when you create false expectations, or you create unrealistic expectations, is that when something marginally different from that happens, when in fact the debate is a lot closer than you think, then people, I think, inevitably are going to say, well, Gore did less well than we expected, Bush did better than we expected, so maybe we ought to call it a draw. And the problem with scoring a debate like that is it's not a classic debate. I mean, the formats are just awful. And I'm not sure how you can find, I mean, if you can give me some ideas, I'd be happy to to try to implement them, I'm not sure how you can find an appropriate panel that would be regarded by people on the right and on the left as being fair-minded enough to give a sort of degree of difficulty of this debate. 2.5 multiplied by, we see a 7.5 for Gore in the first debate and a 7.9 for Al Gore, and then you multiply it by 3.5 and you come up with a mathematical sort of conclusion. I'm not very happy when they do it in ice skating or diving. I don't think we can do it in politics. And in a sense, the Bush campaign did a terrific job of hyping Gore's reputation as one of the greatest debaters of the 20th century. And the Gore people did not do an adequately equivalent job of saying, look, this guy is not dumb. He may not have spent a great deal of his life focusing on certain issues like foreign policy, but frankly, neither had Jimmy Carter, and neither had Bill Clinton, and neither had Ronald Reagan. Let's wait for the debate before we start characterizing how it's going to come out. The Bush people just did a better advanced job on that, and the end result was that by the time the spinners got through with it, everybody was convinced that that Bush had not only pulled out a draw, but might even have won a debate or two. I must say I agree with you. I don't think any of his performances were that good, but frankly, I don't think any of Al Gore's performances were that overwhelming either.
Yes, over here.
Good evening. My name is Heidi Hanfel. I'm a marketing strategist and a writer.
Sounds ominous.
And it's such a pleasure to see you face to face over a crowd than through a television screen.
Thank you.
My question, you're welcome. My question takes you back in time. I'm curious, when creative, dynamic people are little kids, what interests you had then and how they may correlate or may not correlate to your interests of today.
I think the simplest answer, and the only one that leaps to mind at the moment, is that I've always been a ravenous reader. I love to read from the earliest time that I could put those letters together, and I just devour the written word to this very day. So I suppose at some point or another it was going to be inevitable that I would be involved in some way with words.
Were you also an investigator as a little guy?
No, not really. Well, unless you count Claire when I was 7, but that was, that's...
Yes,
Thank you.
over here.
Hi, Mr. Koppel. My name is Brian Porter. I'm a student at the Public Health School here at Harvard. You had mentioned earlier that you don't see it as your mission to be value neutral, but rather just not to let your values or your opinions affect your professional behavior and conduct. I think that's a very admirable ideal, and I think we hear that a lot from everyone from lawyers to judges to doctors, but time and time again, we see that that simply can't be done. Humans bring just an enormous amount of cultural, emotional, et cetera, baggage to any context, and it influences their behavior. How do you, I almost feel that, and this isn't just directed at you personally, but as a whole profession, how egotistical or even delusional do you think that concept is? And again, this isn't a personal attack, but really I think as myself, whatever I'm going to go into, we all bring our values, and how can you say that you could be neutral, from that perspective?
Well, let me put it this way. If I were sitting up here as a surgeon, and I were to say to you, look, I don't have to like my patients. Mm-hmm. I operate on people that I've actively disliked. May have even been tempted to leave just a little sponge in there on occasion. Do you have any trouble accepting the notion that a surgeon can set aside his personal opinions while he or she is operating in order to perform that task professionally, and I'll come back to you in a moment.
Sure.
And I put the same question to you if I was sitting up here as an attorney. Mm-hmm. And I said to you, look, I've had some clients that I really couldn't stand. And I was tempted to throw the case because I would have enjoyed seeing that SOB in jail. But I didn't. I did the best damn job I could because that's what I'm professionally required to do. I'm simply saying to you, not that I believe that any of us in journalism has the superhuman quality of being able to set his or her opinions aside totally while functioning, that I think I can do it well enough that my challenge to you is, of the people that you have seen me interview on Nightline, tell me if you think I like them or dislike them.
Right.
Tell me if you think I agree with them or disagree with them. And I think most of the time, you might be surprised to find out that you're wrong. Because I don't, at least I try very hard not to convey it when I'm on the air. Do I fail sometimes? You bet. But as you so generously pointed out, we do.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
Over here.
Yeah, I just
Could
wanted
you
to...
identify yourself?
Oh, my name is Chuck Palsman, and I'm not a student at Harvard. Okay.
Comes as a shock to me.
At any rate, just to amplify one of the questions that I wanted to, on your last answer, one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I didn't, is who in the world will take your place? Because I don't know of anybody in the media that handles both sides or 10 sides of an issue as well as you do. There's nobody that comes
Well,
close.
very kind. Thank you. The jury will disregard counsel's comments.
No, I think
No.
I think it also says something about maybe how people are being educated that they can't even conceive that can be done sometimes, you know?
Well, look, I think there are, I'm not just saying this. Modesty is not one of my normal afflictions. I think there are, maybe not scores, but I think there are dozens of outstanding journalists in network television today. And, you know, the problem we confront, and I'm getting to an age now where I really do think about my responsibility to help the transition into an era when someone else will be doing the program, both as an anchor and also, you know, my dear friend Tom Batag, who is our executive producer. Tom and I have worked together now for almost 10 years, and see it as our obligation over the course of the next 5 years, we just signed 5-year contracts, to begin the process of transition. And the way you do that is not by trying to find a Ted Koppel clone. You know, you don't do that. There are other people who have other abilities and will bring other things to the program that I was totally unable to bring to the program. And the important thing is to nurture those in such a way that when the transition takes place, you will barely notice it. And that really is my hope, that we can do that.
Okay. My question now was, I actually wanted to follow up on this why there aren't great politicians in the world today, and I've always had I just wondered
didn't say there aren't any great. I mean, for example, I think
Right.
I think Nelson Mandela was one of the exceptions. I think he was a great
Yes.
leader.
Okay, I understand. But my understanding in this country, and I'm wondering what you think of it, is that in the last 20 years there has been such a proliferation of fragmentation of interest as the economy gets more and more complex, that trying to find common values at this point on which a great leader could play just isn't there at this point. And you know, you say one thing and there's 10 million against you.
Now, you see, forgive me, but I think the essence of leadership is to identify those great issues and bring them to the attention of a general public which perhaps has not had the time or the information available to focus on them themselves. And the nature of great leadership, I mean, remember, Winston Churchill didn't just become a leader with the beginning of World War II. He had been crying in the wind there for several years, was much maligned, much fun of him was made when he warned of the consequences of what was going on in Germany. You know, I think the essence of leadership is not to point it out when it's obvious to everybody. The essence of leadership is to identify it early and then make it your goal to enlighten the American public. And that's where I think the Clinton administration, for example, has been weakest in its foreign policy. And that is, set aside for a moment whether you think that becoming involved in Kosovo militarily was in the U.S. public interest. I happen to believe it probably was not. But again, set that aside. No, please. Set that aside. Where I find the administration totally lacking is if you're going to lead the American military into a war, however limited you think it may be, it has to be for reasons of acute national interest being threatened. Once you have identified that national interest, it is your responsibility to begin the process of educating the American public. And in this respect, compare, for example, the lead up to Operation Desert Storm, when George Bush and his cabinet officers were sort of searching around for reasons that they could get the American public to accept and understand and agree with in terms of the vital, and you remember at first they tried it purely from the humanitarian point of view. What was happening to those poor Kuwaitis under Iraqi domination. Didn't get very far. Finally, then, they began talking about the issue that was really at the root of it, and that is we were not only worried about the oil that was in Kuwait, but we were worried that if we didn't stand up to Saddam in Kuwait, he might be encouraged to move into Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Persian Gulf. First, you have to identify what the issue is. Then you have to convince the American public, and then before you go to war, you have to be prepared to lose thousands of young Americans. And it is the absolute responsibility of the chief executive of the United States to do that. You don't get into a war and then fight it in such a way that, on the one hand, you're trying to win the war, on the other hand, you're trying to do it, on the pretext that somehow it is possible these days to fight wars with only their boys and girls dying. Doesn't work that way. If you go to war, you have to be prepared to lose your young men and women, and you have an obligation to prepare the American public for that. That is the essence of leadership.
Up here.
I'm Andreas Daniel Fogg, a gainfully employed worker for Boise Cascade. I contribute, but I'm not published by the American Prospect and some other journals. I wondered if you would comment on a number of ideas, just a few ideas.
We're coming to the end. Could you just give us one?
All right, excessive corporate mergers affecting media decision-making, specifically as it's come to your attention as the director of Nightline in regard to treatment of the greenhouse effect and...
Okay, well that's...
Okay?
All right, sure. To answer the last part of your first question, it hasn't come to my attention at all. I mean, if you're suggesting that someone at the Disney Corporation is passing the word down, don't do anything on the greenhouse effect, or do something on the greenhouse effect, I'm unaware of any, I missed that memo. On the other hand, does it concern me that we have all of these gigantic media mergers and therefore that many of the more powerful voices are coalescing and that therefore look, let me put it, forgive me for sort of stopping in the middle of my own sentence, but it's my observation that the one guarantee of quality control in journalism is competition. What worries me most is that I will get a story wrong. What worries me most next is that one of my colleagues from CBS or NBC will get it right and point out that I got it wrong. That is what keeps journalists honest, is the fear of competition. Without competition, we can write anything we want. I'm here to tell you that I don't think all of us would, but competition is the guarantor of quality control. Therefore, anything that diminishes competition, I worry about. The good news is that in this day and age, I mean, when I joined ABC 37 years ago, there were 3 ways that you could get a television message out to millions of people. You could be hired by CBS, you could be hired by NBC, or you could be hired by ABC. These days, any 20-year-old with $1,000 can buy a $500 digital camera, a $500 editing unit from Apple, and you can get on the internet, and with one stroke of the key, what you have put out there as a television report is accessible, theoretically at least, to millions if they choose to log on to that site. In other words, any one person with $1,000 and the technical know-how to do it can today be a network. We have yet to see the consequences of that happening. I'm predicting to you that you're going to see some great stars evolving from very humble circumstances because the technology now makes it possible. So at that end, diversity is increasing. At the bigger end, diversity is diminishing.
Great.
My name is Doug Shipman. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School, and one of the books that's quite popular around here is Chris Matthews' Hardball. In that book, he has a chapter called The Press is the Enemy, and I'm wondering, going back to the relationship you spoke about that exists now in Washington, if there are those of us who are considering public office, what should be the relationship that we try to foster as public officials or as staff members with the press?
Perfect case study of how to get the press to suck up to you on a daily basis in actually a pretty decent way. That example was set by Senator John McCain during the primary season. What did he do? He had this bus, didn't have as much money as George W. Bush, so he went for the free publicity of sitting in the back of that bus sometimes 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day, hours at a time, allowing the members of the press to ask him anything they wanted. Anything. No holds barred. And look at the kind of coverage that he got. And look at what happened to the occasional slips that he made. Because the press took into account that the guy's not only working a tremendously long schedule campaigning, but he's coming in and saying, go ahead, have at me, ask me anything you want. Go ahead. We can debate, we can argue, we can talk, you can ask, I will answer. And if he occasionally stepped into it, yeah, he got some bad stories out there, but did they last more than a day or two? No, because there was a sense of fair play among the journalists who said, whatever his motives for doing it, he is being totally accessible to us. So if the guy in a moment of fatigue, says something that he's going to be a little sorry for later on, well, maybe we'll put it in paragraph 17 instead of leading with it. And John McCain got some of the best coverage that any politician has gotten in recent years. And despite the criticism from some quarters that, we all just sort of were seduced by John McCain and yeah, we were. We were seduced by accessibility. We were seduced by this uncommon apparition of a politician who was willing to talk to us at any time of the day or night on any subject that we chose. It worked.
One more over here.
Hi, my name is Lara Satrakian. I'm a student at the college here at Harvard. Along with the advent of the 24-hour news network has come 24-hour news on the internet, like you mentioned, and with people less willing to spend a half an hour watching television or reading a newspaper and more willing to click a mouse to get all the information they think they need for the day, what do you foresee as the future of broadcast journalism? Is it the beginning of the end for radio and television and the beginning of an internet age? And also, how will that affect the importance of the image when people are seeing their journalists and their politicians less and reading about them more on their computer screen?
It's a terrific question, but first of all, again, the last part of your question, I don't think your premise for the future is correct. At the moment, the internet primarily offers you, a print alternative. But as I was indicating a moment ago in an answer to another question, I think the day is upon us when we are going to start seeing not just hundreds, but thousands of people who say, look, I want to be a television journalist. And I'm 21 years old or 22 years old, and ABC and NBC and CBS and Fox and CNN and MSNBC are not going to hire me right now, at least not as a correspondent. So I'm going to do it on my own. And I'm going to go out and shoot my own stories. I'm going to write my own stories. I'm going to edit my own stories, and then I'm going to put them on the internet. And what I am predicting to you, first of all, is that 1 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 of those tens of thousands of young journalists who do that will break through, that they will be so good. And I mean, we sometimes get totally arthritic about our ability to recognize talent in truly young people. When I was 23 and I wanted to be hired by ABC and ultimately was hired by ABC, I had to push like hell. And I was just lucky because they were hiring people for a radio program, and I said, look, nobody can tell how young I am on the radio. Right? I have an older sounding voice. I think the future in that respect is brilliant. We're going to have some terrific people come out of that. What is also going to come out of that, however, is a sense of what I refer to as information anarchy. Chaos. You won't know with many of these people who they are. You won't know whether this is a foreign government, for example, or a foreign intelligence agency that is putting out a piece of video with commentary. You won't know whether it's some corporate giant that has decided the way to really work this is to get some folks out there and simply put it on the internet without identifying where it's from. And in that context, it is my belief that there actually is a future for network television, but that future lies not so much in the direction that some have been going over the last few years, which is trying to meet them, down here on the lowest common denominator, but to be absolutely the best that we can be, and to sort of say to all of you who are concerned about the genesis of certain stories, okay, you may think that Koppel combs his hair in a funny way, but you've known him most of your lives, and on balance, you think he's okay. So let's check out what Koppel's doing on Nightline, or let's check out what the New York Times is doing, or the Boston Globe is doing, because believe me, the great frustration in the immediate future is going to be that you have thousands of items appearing on the internet, and you don't know which ones to believe anymore. And you're going to have to go back to some old tried and true, if not friends, at least familiar faces in the media, to give your sense, to give yourself a little bit of sense of where we are.
Last question I'm going to ask, because I want to bring it back to Ted Koppel, the man, a little bit in the spirit of this of your book. One of the threads that runs through the book, you describe yourself as essentially a non-practicing Reform Jew.
Yes.
Your children are Catholic, as is their mother. But you describe how you spent last year not only writing a journal every day, but reading the Old Testament every day.
Not every day, but I try most of it.
You posed the question, which I've never thought of before, and I found fascinating, about how you'd like to have some religious folks address exactly where the location of heaven and hell are geographically.
It's becoming more and more difficult as we explore
indeed
some of the old concepts. Right?
And you end with a note that I would consider to be a religious note. You write, "In face of all the miracles of science and technology, God's size and power remain proportionately to our own, as great or greater than ever." I just wanted to ask how this spiritual dimension, however you define it, plays into your work, life, your career, your sense of who you are.
Boy, you did save the toughest for last, didn't you? I'm not a great believer in ritual, but I am a great believer in the existence of some greater force than ourselves. And I am a great believer in the obligation that that force, or the sense of obligation that that force has imbued in each of us. Call it the divine spark, call it the conscience, call it whatever you want to call it. But I think it is necessary to take out a little bit of time every day, if you can, and I think you should, to say, all right, what is that divine spark telling me? I used to wonder when I was a little boy about these sort of commonplace notions of God as this great paternal figure up there somewhere, keeping notes, rather like that song about Santa Claus, checking who's naughty and who's nice. And while I understood that we could not hope to comprehend the Almighty, I still thought, boy, that's, how can it possibly know what each of us is doing at all times? And I came as a youngster to a conclusion that I found, to my delight, was actually a rather familiar conclusion to many religious people, and that is that we have as part of us this divine spark that can either grow or diminish depending on how we treat it and how much attention we pay to it. And I don't always pay as much attention to it as I should. Lord knows, probably pay less attention to it than I should. But I try to remain aware of its existence. And that's the best I can do on short notice.
Ted Koppel, thank you very much.
Yeah.